over the last couple of weeks, I've had some conversations, and they've been unusual in the people have asked me how to handle grief or loss. And when I get asked those questions, I usually turn them inward and ask myself, well, how have I handled grief and loss? And when I think about grief, I recall that lady in the north of Sri Lanka, and you were having the conversation with her, and it was in the context of we were having a seminar on trauma and struggling with it, and she was drawing the tree of life.
Yeah, I remember she was sitting there just like this with her head in her hands, just kind of staring into space. And so I grabbed my interpreter and sat down with her and talked about her life as the tree. And she looked at me and she said, I'm not strong enough to cry. And even though everybody around was weeping with all the trauma that had happened to them, she couldn't, not yet anyway. And it's stayed with us, hasn't it?
Well, it really resonated with me because if I was to ask that question of myself, what have I done with my grief? I would have answered that I wasn't strong enough to cry. Because in a sense, the tears meant that I'd gone to that place. I'd gone to the edge, the precipice, and looked over into grief, and it looked scary. I didn't want to go there. It looked like I would fall into an emotional, out of control place. And so I pulled back from the edge. I did not want to go to the place of tears because I did not know what would result if I went into that place.
Actually, mine has been the opposite, and there's our differences again. And they were pretty hard to resolve at different times in our life because grief for me was present and overwhelming. You know, things had happened in my life and in the life of our family, and I couldn't get away from my grief. But I was stuck in the grief. It wasn't like I could, you know, process it in some way and move on and have healing for that grief. I was just stuck.
So when you spoke to this girl in Sri Lanka, what did that do to you in that process of grief?
In a sense, it connected with me too, because I wasn't strong enough to cry about what that grief meant. I wasn't strong enough to actually go inside and discover what the grief was teaching me and what God wanted me to learn from that grief and what it said about me and my identity.
So when you say you were stuck, you were just stuck in a place of grief. Were there tears, or was it?
Oh yeah, there were often tears, but I like to call it clean and dirty grief. It's like a clean grief cleanses and you move forward with life, but a dirty grief keeps you stuck in a horrible place, and that's what mine was like for many years.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because in my little system, I know that if I go to the place of grief, I'll have to ask some questions that I really don't want to ask, like, God, where were you? How come this has happened to me? And those questions I struggle with. They're painful questions to ask because they challenge my hope, my faith.
Why are you allowing this to happen?
Yeah. And so I stay away from that. In actual fact, I don't like living in paradox land. I prefer things to be black and white. And so it's an invitation to go and somehow become comfortable with what is not known.
So what you're saying is grief is kind of revealing to us what we're doing with God or not.
Yeah.
There's we go back to the weeping prophet Jeremiah in Lamentations.
Yes, yeah. Remember when we went to the north of Uganda in a little town called Gulu, and we knew when we were going there that the people that we would have the opportunity to be with would have experienced horrible traumatic events, and they would have had the grief of lost ones. It would have just been
and every woman in that particular meeting had been raped as a result of war. The grief was just palpable in the room. And we prayed about it. We asked God, how can we best minister to these people? And he kind of led us to the book of Lamentations and Lament. And we went into the marketplace and we bought a whole lot of African drums and we took them to the meeting and we separated the people into groups and asked them to compose a lament. It didn't have to have words. They could sing it or not. And then they performed it for us. And it was heart-wrenching stuff. It was just heart-wrenching.
They always like things to come from the Bible, which is a good thing. And so we laid down a pattern that we extracted from the book of Lamentations. I mean, Jeremiah was experiencing incredible grief. He'd spent his lifetime praying that the disaster that was heading towards his people and the city of Jerusalem would be averted. But when he writes the book of Lamentations, he's sitting in ashes.
And looking at all the death and destruction around him, it would have been horrendous.
Yeah, and even the temple of God had been ransacked, and so he's in despair, and he's asking the hard questions of God. And so we were able to take them through the book of Lamentations and extract a few things that helped Jeremiah with his grief. And I always remember at the end of it, they had the opportunity to compose their own lament and to perform it. And what I observed there, a couple of things that we extracted from the book of Lamentations and we actually saw in action when we were over there. And one of the things was when we lament, we give voice.
Yeah. Because in your grief, you keep it to yourself. It's very internal and it's very closed off, but to actually express it as a lament gave them a sense of we've all been through this in this community. We're all hurting, we're all in pain, and they were able to express it as a community, and it was quite healing.
I thought that was what I took away from those meetings. It was almost as if they had never used their community, which is very strong, as a place to process some of their painful feelings, because they were common to each of them.
And the other thing that I learned with doing that particular structure of Lamentations is God gives us lament as a form of emotional containment. Because if, I've been a trauma counsellor for years, and I know that people cannot speak about the traumatic events unless they feel internal safety, because they just get re-traumatized. And so God gives us this form of emotional containment. It's
almost as if it's a place where you just hold it and then you can take a little piece out and process it and then go back and take another little piece out.
That's a nice sense, this holding environment, that God gives this holding environment. And I think of some of the lament psalms where David is just held in that environment. Yeah. And at the end of the psalm, he comes back and he says, but my heart turns towards you, God. And we think it happens in the 2 minutes that we read the psalm, but this is quite a long process.
Well, the other lovely thing that I saw in Lamentations was the unadulterated honesty and rawness of Jeremiah's expression of how he felt. And when we conveyed that to them, it gave them permission to just let those ragged words of grief out of their soul. I mean, we didn't know their language, but I saw it in the way they danced, and I never forget that song that one man sang. I cried, but I didn't know what the words were, but I could sense the power of the words. And I just I could read the first couple of verses in Lamentations chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long.
Wow.
those are painful words and raw with honesty.
And he actually goes on for how many verses? Where
Another 20.
where he expresses just stuff that in our churches we think, oh, that's not very nice. But it's almost like he knew that God had given him permission to ask the questions and to doubt God and to ask God the hard question.
And then in the lamentation, he begs for help. He recognises his brokenness. But there's also a longing for wholeness. He wants that wholeness. So it turns him into a place where he knows that God is his only source, and he begs him for help to get through this painful process of losing what he's lost. And the thing about grief is it is inevitable for you and I to experience loss in this world.
Yeah, sadly.
That's what happened way back in Genesis. And it's what we live with. We will experience loss. And so where does this broken person go to for the hope of getting through the loss and experiencing the other side of that gap?
And ironically, I have found that when I actually moved into that lament place myself and honestly gave it voice and was able to express the pain of it, that I actually came out of it believing that God is good, and my relationship with God was stronger for it after asking those really hard questions.
If you had to, looking back, what was one of the catalysts to move you? You said at the beginning that you were stuck. What was one of the cases that moved you?
Ministry with these people that we've been talking about. I watched the way that some of them were incredibly brave at voicing their distress and moving into it, and just seeing the damage that war had done to these people in both those cultures, and kind of asking the questions for them that I could then ask for myself.
Okay.
God, why? How does this person, what's the best they can hope for? That was one of my questions that started my research. What's the best that these people can hope for? Is this as good as it gets? And that started my own journey into this, to ask those questions for myself. What about you?
Actually it was my older brother's death that really shifted me. I was about 40 when my father died, and I can remember there were some tears shed, but because of what was happening in our life and the family pressures and work, I virtually just pushed that grief away and went on with life and didn't experience any sort of grief processing. I can remember a year after he died, a man rang me and just to tell me that he remembered that it was the anniversary, and I burst into tears. So it was underlying everything, but I was not able to connect with it. And when my older brother died, it was as if I was experiencing the grief of his loss, but it also caught my father's. And I went to the precipice and I fell over and I wondered what was happening. I had no experience of that sort of emotional turmoil, the questions, the anger that my brother died before my mother, was out of order, silly things like that, and the challenging God. I can remember one time I was at the traffic lights and a man behind me came up and he was coughing and smoking on a cigarette, and I could smell the smoke around him, and I looked up to heaven and I mumbled, "Take him." And I was just so angry, and so the process began, and I moved through some of them.
How did you get through that?
I knew I needed help. I knew I was in a place that I hadn't been before. I needed a guide in a sense. And so I went to a friend that I trusted, and he was not able to take me on the journey, but he recommended someone, and that man was able to help me with my grief. And some of that was my brother hadn't died, he was in the process of dying, and that man helped me to have conversations with my brother that I would not have had if I hadn't had his input. They were difficult for me, they were emotional.
But how did God come into that?
It's interesting, you know, in my in the morning when I have my time with God, I sit upstairs and the window I have overlooks the bush. And what pressed in on me was the creativeness of God, the beauty. And I can remember saying to him one time, if heaven is better than this, it must be an incredible place. And it just shifted me. And I started to allow God to minister to me. I can remember a dream I had, and I'm not one to follow dreams much at all, but it was very clear. And I was, my brother was in the shower, and I was helping to bathe him, and he had soap all over him, and he began to fall, and I grabbed at him, but because of the soap, he slipped from my arms. And it was as if God was saying, you can let him go now, I've got him. And so it just settled on me a real peacefulness. And I knew God was in charge. He had this.
Actually, at the end of that long litany in Lamentations, he comes to, I think it's verse 23, doesn't he? Is it verse 23?
Yep.
3:23.
Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him.
So in all his lament, he spends 22 verses in that chapter expressing his pain. But then he comes to that. That's the hope. Where else can we go? That's the hope.
It's a good hope.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
And grief is worth working with. It's good to go to the precipice. It's great to have someone to jump with.
Because we meet God. We meet God in the midst of that.
Yeah, I think it just intensifies our understanding, our relationship with him.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening.